Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, Episode 50, British General Thomas Graham.
We have a special guest for this episode joining us from the second time, my good friend Josh Provan from Adventures in Historyland. Say hello, Josh.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me back, John.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. We are going to be covering a very interesting guy today, Thomas Graham, general in the British Army. We were talking earlier before we hopped on the call. Really interesting guy, don't you think?
He's an amazingly interesting guy. I've always thought so, and he doesn't get a lot of press. He comes in like fourth for press actually, behind Wellington, Moore, Hill, really with the British.
Yep. So yeah, we're going to dive into his story. But before we do that, I kind of want to tell my listeners again about your wonderful YouTube page, Adventures in Historyland, and your Twitter page. Could you briefly sum those up for us?
Yes, absolutely. These are the places where I get to exercise my somewhat unfocused mind when it comes to my interest in history. Adventures in Historyland is a place for everybody. Everybody has one. Everybody can find one. Mine happens to be found on Twitter at Land of History, and online the blog, which is being sorely neglected at the moment, I have to admit. Is just Adventures in Historyland. By the end of July, my manuscript for my forthcoming book, which is entitled Every Hazard and Fatigue, the Siege of Pensacola, 1781, which is sort of the climax of the Spanish campaign of the American Revolution.
Fantastic.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying the process at the second of writing it, so I'll keep you posted.
Well, let's jump into our subject matter.
Thomas Graham, he wasn't a general yet when he was born. He was born in October 1748 in Perthshire, Scotland. He was the third and only...
Nicely done.
Thank you. Yeah, I was working on that before we recorded, but yeah. He was the third and only surviving son of his family. Can you tell us a bit about his upbringing and his parents?
Yes, absolutely. His father was Thomas Graham of Balgowan, and his mother was Lady Christian Hope, a relative of another one of Wellington's generals. And she was therefore the daughter of the Earl of Hopetoun. And the sister, she was to be specific, she was the sister to the General Hope in Wellington's army.
Okay.
Thomas, the elder, was a country gentleman. He was what in Scotland you call a laird, which is somewhat equivalent to a lord. But in the strata of nobility of the time, it wasn't seen as the same rank as the English lord.
Right.
Nevertheless, he was an important man. In the district, he owned a lot of land. He was devoted to hunting and land management, and as a result, he didn't leave his estates very much. He was educated privately, but very expensively. One of his tutors was a noted classical scholar who had translated the works of Ossian, I believe, and his name was James Macpherson. One of young Thomas's earliest memories was, as a young boy, a nanny taking him down to see a regiment of dragoons passing by the estate. But he never, like you say, had any intention of being a soldier growing up. He's very much an elder son, and Thomas was the surviving son, and so he was going to inherit these lands, and so it was very important that he basically became a farmer.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Thomas attends college, and then he also travels extensively through Europe. He picks up languages like French, German, and Spanish. And it seems like he could have lived a life of luxury, and it seems that he kind of does that, right? In his 20s, he's like a country gentleman.
Absolutely. One biographer said that tour of his was less the traditional grand tour, as it was a series of extended sort of holidays. He traveled in the company of his cousin, Lord Hope, who I mentioned before. He did attend Oxford when he came home. But there's no doubt he could have remained happily as a civilian after his father's death, just managing his estates, because much like his father, he was a very attentive sort of landowner.
Right.
And as the Laird of Balgowan, he was an important man in local affairs, and he did try to be useful and not just sort of a private citizen, but absolutely he didn't need to seek adventure, really.
Right. Yeah, it looks like, he's going on deer hunts and just enjoying the sporting life throughout his 20s. But midway through his 20s, though, he gets married to his first wife, Mary. What do we know of her background?
Well, Mary is a very fascinating figure from the 18th century. She's not as well known as some of the celebrated women of the period, but she is known for a very special reason. Her full name was Mary Cathcart before she was married. She was the second daughter of the 9th Lord Cathcart.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was roughly from the same sort of class background as Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
She was sketched in words, so to speak, by Robert Burns, who met her at Blair Athol, which is a castle in Perthshire. And he called her the beautiful Mrs. Graham. And she was immortalized by the painter Gainsborough. And her charm and grace and ethereal sort of beauty, if you've ever seen the portrait, commanded the interest and pretty much the devotion, so people say, of everyone who met her. In the year after her marriage, Graham took her to London to be painted by Gainsborough. This is how the painting was created. And Gainsborough was so entranced with it that he not only painted the commission, but an amazing full-length portrait in a sort of a special gown, which he exhibited in 1777, and that made her somewhat famous because everybody was saying, "My goodness, that's the Cathcart girl. That's Mrs. Graham, isn't it?"
Right.
My goodness,
Right.
Yeah, Thomas was absolutely in love with her. Which it's not very surprising if you've ever seen the portrait.
Yeah. No.
There's a
Lovely to me. I just, he got married. They were looks like they were about to build a nice family together. Did they have any kids or no?
No, they didn't have any children, but that didn't seem to make them unhappy or cause any difficulties. In fact, there's quite a lot of stories about how much they cared about each other. There's one crazy one about Mary forgetting her jewellery box when attending a ball in Edinburgh, and Thomas, being an expert rider, deciding to ride the roughly 42 miles back to Balgowan to fetch it for her. It's just fascinating, the life they made for themselves. And to be honest, it's a sort of an 18th century idyll, really, isn't it? It would make a hopelessly romantic movie, I think.
Yeah, and we really haven't even gotten to the good part yet. So,
No.
Yeah, but yeah, he doesn't initially join the military. He instead opting to become a farmer, and in 1785 he purchased the estate of Lynedoch, which becomes important in his titles later on. Correct?
It does. He definitely had no interest in being a soldier at this time, and as you say, Lynedoch was purchased as a pet project. It was a small plot of land as a pet project by Graham, and he lavished a lot of attention on renovating the cottage there and the parkland, and it will indeed become the name he is best known by contemporaries when it's given to him as a title for his service. But we're jumping ahead a bit there.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that. Here's where the story starts to get dark, though. Like, life is going well. He's rich. He's got a nice farm. He's cultivating and reshaping the landscape. But in 1792, his wife's health begins to decline. And for some reason, her medical advisor recommends a trip to France with her husband. Seems like an odd time to me to visit France in the midst of the chaotic French Revolution. And she passes away during the voyage over to France. Can you, what happens there?
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody, to shatter the wonderful picture we just so abruptly painted for you. But that, in sum, is what happened. So as to traveling to France, war hadn't been declared yet, technically, and so travel was still possible. Politically, there was a lot of people in England at this time, especially liberals, and Graham was a liberal. He was a moderate Whig, and a lot of these people somewhat approved of what was going on a constitutional level in France at the time, in terms of sort of curtailing the power of the king and establishing a sort of or what they hoped was going to be sort of a British style constitutional parliament sort of thing.
Right.
There was also, I guess, most eyes were fixed on Paris from a British perspective. And so it probably seemed safe enough because they went to the south of France. So they probably didn't associate the troubles as being that widespread, I guess.
Right.
Mrs. G, as Thomas sometimes referred to his wife in letters, had always been somewhat frail. It's suspected that she had undiagnosed consumption from quite an early period. And she began to feel seriously unwell sometime it could have been as early as 1791. They had been advised that sea bathing in the south of France would be beneficial. And after this stay in Nice, though, her condition worsened, and the attending physician, who had actually sailed over from England, suggested a sea voyage. But very tragically, she passed away from whatever the condition was, probably consumption, near a place called Hieres in June of 1792.
Right.
Even more tragically, Graham was not with her at the time. He had gone on shore. They'd anchored, and he'd gone on shore and had gone to the town because he'd been told it wasn't very far away, but it was. And he came back only to find she had died an hour before. It just breaks your heart, really.
Yeah, because you just painted that beautiful picture, their idyllic landscape. She's this beautiful woman, and she dies on her way to get treatment. But that's not even the worst part of the story. Thomas Graham hires a barge to move her remains for a proper burial, but a group of French soldiers near Toulouse opened her coffin and disturbed her body. Can you tell me what the heck happened there?
Okay. Yeah, but okay. Yeah, strap yourself in, because here we go. Graham and Mary's sister took we're going to take the remains back to the mainland, and had made arrangements to take a canal to Toulouse and then on to Bordeaux. Now, it was already July. It had taken a while to get back to the mainland anyway, because there was bad weather. And he'd started to write home, this is Thomas, instructing that much of the Balgowan estate should be closed up or sold off, because he wasn't going to live there anymore, or at least for some time, because he was really crushed.
Right.
He didn't anticipate wanting to see anything of his old life, pretty much. Now, the custom officer at Agde sur Hérault, which is the Hérault is a river in France, had already demanded Graham to open the coffin before allowing him to proceed to up the canal to Toulouse. But of course, Graham said, "No, what are you, mad?"
Right.
And so he went to a place called Sète, where the director of customs had pity on him and gave him the paperwork which he would need to proceed to Bordeaux. So they reached Toulouse after a brief rest. They were going to carry on their journey, and they're getting the barge ready, when a group of the town guard and Republican volunteers appeared and held them up. They wanted to search the baggage. Now, the account I read absolutely says that they were drunk. I don't know how many of them were drunk, or what sort of how high the altitudes were, to use an old expression, but they demanded. They got to the coffin basically, and they demanded, "Let's see what's in there." And of course, Graham said, "Well, that's my deceased wife. I'm not going to open the coffin." They said that, and they basically fired back that if he didn't open it, they weren't going to let him pass. Now, Graham went and appealed to the mayor, who did issue an order to let him go without any trouble. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to do any good whatsoever because, I mean, it's put in the biographies basically that because the revolution was happening, these people had no respect for authority, and kind of were just doing whatever they wanted. And they seized Graham, threw insults at him, and declared that there was contraband in the coffin, and basically wrenched it open. They did this with such violence that they broke it, and they had to. So it was in such bad repair. I must assume they must have basically snapped the lid. Basically, they must have broken the lid to get into it.
Right.
Because Graham had to buy a new, I think it was a tin coffin or something like that later on. Or probably lead, actually. A new lead coffin was bought. But this is what happened. They desecrated the remains, basically. I don't think they messed around with it. Nothing says they messed around with the body once it was obviously there's a dead woman in there.
Right.
But the very act of basically holding Graham under arrest and then tearing open the coffin is just the worst imaginable torture, given what he's just been through.
Yeah.
They stayed a few more days in Toulouse after this event, trying to get justice, and obviously they needed to repair the coffin. But the justice of the peace, first of all, didn't want to get involved, and then when he did get involved, he tried to keep them there until the court case was settled. And Graham just said, "Fine, I'm not prosecuting. I'm just getting out of here." And he proceeded to Britain without further incident.
Wow.
And it's pretty dark.
Okay. Well, at the age of 43 now, the widower, Thomas Graham, resolves to take a career in the military. So I guess this is kind of a tricky question. Do you think that he had some sort of awakening after his wife's death?
I think we have to understand that Graham had already found meaning in his life before Mary died.
Right. True.
And I think her death took a lot of it away from him. He hid his misery very bravely, but the desecration of the coffin at least did give him an enemy, and someone to hate, someone to blame, someone to focus on. There's this combination of just losing everything that you thought you had and now having to rebuild it all. I mean, he was unable to occupy his old house where he'd been so happy. He couldn't really resume his old role right away as laird without just constant reminder of what was now gone.
Right.
And this compelled him to act in the struggle, like you say, to take back control, maybe chase the demons of his old life away.
Right.
And I think, actually, as we'll see, especially in the years closely followed, I think he might secretly have wanted to die.
Yeah, you might be right. Well, in 1793, he sees his first military action in the Siege of Toulon, which was a loss for the British and became Napoleon's first major victory that he was associated with. How did the now soldier Graham perform under fire?
Graham's military life is such a mess. It's so confusing to try and explain to people. So right now he's still technically not a soldier. He's still he wants to be involved in the war somehow, but he doesn't take an actual rank position at this moment. At Toulon, his role is very curious. It's a volunteer, essentially.
Right.
And it's a volunteer because he knows quite a lot of people in the Navy, and he sort of goes on an extended military cruise hoping to see some action, and ends up in the blockading squadron off Toulon. And because of his excellent language skills, he's one of the first British, we'll say, officers, because he was sort of taken on as an aide-de-camp, to land, although he had no actual rank at this time. So he was, but he was actively involved in the defense of the town. And to be honest, he's one of the only British participants connected with the army, at least, who comes out of the capture and then loss of Toulon with any credit.
Right.
And he really throws himself into the fray, and this speaks to what I was talking about a minute ago. he's really keen to get into action.
Mm-hmm.
When he can't find a horse in one occasion, he gets a coach, a cabriolet, and he rides that towards the sound of the firing, to the horror of some nearby royalist French guardsmen who like yell after him, "Stop! Stop! Good God, you don't go to war in a cabriolet." um, but and then on another occasion, Graham, because you have to understand that at the siege of Toulon, there was a very strategic hill that overlooked the defenses that
Yeah.
needed to be defended.
Yep.
And Graham had identified this as a place that needed to be fortified. A lot of people thought that it was sort of an impregnable sort of edifice that could just be left as it was. And not a lot of people listened to him, so he very dramatically scaled the steepest part of this of the cliffs of this hill, to prove that it could be done, because in his words, he was more used to hills than other people. Again, that's quite a dangerous, risky thing just to jump into.
Right.
And it kind of shows that he's willing to risk a lot. And then, so this hill is actually taken by the French.
Right.
And then they have to retake it. And in the attack to retake it, he volunteers to join one of the attacking columns. And as he's moving forward, the columns come under fire. He writes quite a detailed account of this. So it obviously had a very strong impression on him. This was the first time he'd ever been shot at in anger. And a man next to him is wounded, and he helps him to the rear, and then takes his musket when he returns back to the fighting. On his way, he gets hit by a musket ball in the right arm, and he stumbles and he drops his musket, and he says that. But then after realizing the bone was not broken, I picked up the musket with my left hand and continued back to rejoin the battle, because he recognized that at such times a good example was very important with a man.
Yeah, but he's just incredibly brave, and he doesn't know what he doesn't know. Like, he doesn't know he shouldn't be doing these things.
No, it's a mixture of that. He's not a soldier. He's not trained for it. He actually writes. It's fascinating. He actually writes that he was just so interested in what was going on, he didn't feel afraid. It was so curious to be in the midst of this chaos, that he didn't feel afraid. And that as well, that is why I'm also suspicious that he may not have had a great regard for his own life at this time.
He gets an officer rank, lieutenant colonel, in 1796, and receives permission to assist the Austrians in their Italian campaign against Napoleon, which again is a major loss for the Austrians. Do you think Graham is gaining valuable experience during these setbacks against Napoleon?
Definitely. The more experience you get in such matters coming from zero, pretty much is going to be great. It's going to be great for you if you're going to try and pursue this. I mean, I don't even know what he's thinking at the moment. He's just happy to be busy.
Right. But like Napoleon's tactics and the French tactics. So when he meets them later again in Spain, he's kind of aware of what they tend to do.
Well, that is an interesting thought. I mean, of all the British officers that end up fighting in Spain, he will have seen more of the French than some of them. Has to be said. Right. Although, in this instance, what happened was he unluckily ended up with the Austrian forces that got bottled up in, I think it Mantua, and basically he has to escape.
That's another epic story.
It is. It's the man's early life, right up to his romantic beginnings, and then his early war service is something right out of a John Buchan novel. It's insane. But yeah, he does this insane escape, crossing rivers in disguise to deliver dispatches, and he gets away. But we need to remind the audience as well that he's still not a full regular commissioned officer. He's still a volunteer with the local rank, the temporary rank of lieutenant colonel, because he has raised a regiment of infantry.
Got it.
For the army, he's raised the 90th Foot, the Perthshire Regiment, and he And interestingly enough, this is how Rowland Hill gets his start.
Mm-hmm.
He was a friend of Graham. Graham knew everybody, and Hill was an excellent officer. And Graham said, "I want good officers in the regiment, so I'm going to get Hill," and that's how Hill got to be a major in the army. But Graham is actually still without a rank, but with a lot of respect. It's a very, very curious situation.
Yeah, and just moving the story along, he, after peace is briefly declared with France in 1802, he returns to England to focus on his political career. Can you tell us a bit about his political life?
Yeah, little. He, like I said, he was a Whig. He was a liberal. He slowly got more and more interested in politics as he went on. He'd actually been elected MP for Perthshire in 1794. He was fully committed to being a soldier and taking care of his regiment, but he did make sure that he didn't neglect his constituents who offered a vote of thanks to him in October of 1802. And he maintained a great interest in getting practical reforms into Scotland, especially the regulation of weights and measures and the curtailing of the malt tax. And throughout Addington and Pitt's administrations, though, nobody says that he made any great mark. He was very quiet in Parliament, and he described himself not really as a party man, but just as a supporter of the government. But he was an admirer of James Fox, the more radical liberal, and he did support Catholic emancipation, which was the reason why he did not stand again for the re-election in 1807, when it was clear that the opposition was too strong to make headway with it. And so he then became very much more associated with the Whig Party, but also he tried ever more to further his military career, which was very difficult because he'd gone about it just the wrong way. There was a friend of his who said that basically what you need to do, you have a lot of money, you don't know how the system works, all you have to do is buy the lowest officer rank in the Blues in the Household Cavalry, and in a year or so you'll be a colonel, because that's just the way it works. But Graham didn't want to be an officer, the rank of an officer that was usually given to a teenager. He thought that because he had raised 2 battalions of a regiment, the Duke of York should just give him a regular commission as a colonel. But York had rules that you had to serve a certain amount of time at each stage of the officer sort of branch before you could do that, even buy the commissions.
Well, moving along in our story, because we're not even halfway through, because he's done. I mean, his resume is incredible. In 1808, there's an expedition going to Portugal and Spain with Sir John Moore to help the Portuguese against their fight again with France and Napoleon. Graham joins Moore as an aide-de-camp. How does that campaign go?
Not terribly well.
That's a nice euphemism. Not terribly well. Okay.
No, it didn't go terribly well. Graham had been after he left politics, he did this partially because he knew he had an opportunity to join Moore's staff, because Moore was going to Sweden. Sweden was the place that the Peninsula War was meant to kind of happen. Unfortunately for Moore, that didn't work out because Moore was a difficult guy to get along with if from a diplomatic point of view. We don't have time to go into the foibles of Sir John Moore at the second, but he was good friends with Thomas Graham. Graham, not being a regular officer and being a fellow Whig, he was a guy that Moore could confide in, he could get along with. Graham was very charming, and he was an extra aide-de-camp when he went to, was rerouted to Portugal, and he joined him on the abortive invasion of Spain, which led to the retreat to Corunna, or Coruña, as we should probably say it. And he was literally beside Moore at the Battle of Corunna when a French cannonball bounced or ricocheted in front of Moore and hit him. The ball had actually passed under his armpit and all but severed his arm.
Yeah.
And taken away most of the flesh from his from that side of his chest.
Right.
And it was a terrible mortal wound.
Right.
Graham immediately galloped for help, and some of Moore's last words were asking after Colonel Graham and his aides-de-camp, are they well? Moore also remembered Graham in his dispatches, which is the critical thing that Graham gets out of the Corunna campaign, and that is a recommendation from the dying martyr to be promoted properly. And that's how he gets his actual commission, because Moore asked for it.
Okay, so the British are evacuating Corunna. Sir John Moore has just been killed. What happens to our friend Graham as we're departing Spain?
Well, he goes back much as he left, but Moore's dispatches precede him, and in the dispatches of the battle is the report of the where he commends officers to the king and everything like that, and one of them is Graham. So it's basically one of the last wishes of Sir John Moore to have Graham confirmed as a regular officer in the army, which is something that Graham has been unable to achieve all the way up to this point. But nobody can deny the last wishes of the fallen martyr, and so he is finally sort of brought into the regular army, the seniority of the regular army. And he actually soon becomes a general.
Well, what a moving story that is. Can you imagine? You just lost your commanding general, and then you get back to England and you find out that your commanding general has promoted you without you, or at least brought you into the army without you even knowing it.
Yeah, it must have been quite a moment, especially as Moore was a good friend of Graham's.
Yeah. So in 1809, though, he's dispatched to yet another disastrous campaign at Walcheren. During I believe it's the Fifth Coalition against Napoleon. What happens there? Why is that a disaster?
I highly recommend listeners read Dr. Jacqueline Reiter's book called The Late Lord, which is a biography of the Lord Chatham, who commanded that expedition, for a proper in-depth kind of idea of what went wrong. But you're looking at sort of a failure due to planning issues, poor understanding of the objective. Chatham did not have a tremendously cohesive force, and he made some logical, but in the end, poor decisions that were exacerbated by exterior problems, and this allowed the French to recover and mount a successful defense.
Yeah, I read, just kind of a swampy area. Chatham set up camp there, and Marshal Bernadotte basically just hemmed him in and surrounded him there, and the mosquitoes and the disease did the rest.
Graham, who is now a major general in command of one of the divisions, was invalided home due to the sickness. It's a classically farcical, disastrous British military expedition of the type that, with some exceptions, had been plaguing the British on the continent since the war began, really.
Well, for those keeping track at home, our friend Graham has now had 4 disasters and when it comes to campaigns. But I think what's really remarkable about him is his perseverance, just in life and in the military.
Yeah, he's a very tough man. He can take some consolation that he's not in command of any of these expeditions. He's just a part of them.
Right.
But yeah, you'd think that being a part of all these disastrous campaigns would more or less make him think, I'll just go back to farming.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, he stuck with it, and He's later on dispatched to Cadiz, Spain, which is under siege by the French. Why is this stronghold so vital to the British and to their interests?
Well, in 1810, Cadiz was the sort of the last stronghold still in Spanish hands, I believe, and it was where the Supreme Junta had fled. So if Cadiz fell, the French could potentially capture the new interim government of Spain,
Right.
which could have been would have been a very great blow to the war effort at the very least. It was very important that they keep it. It's also Cadiz is quite close to Gibraltar, and we all know how much the British like to keep a hold of Gibraltar.
Absolutely, key to the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
But the city itself is quite unique, though. I mean, it has these massive walls, and it can be resupplied by the sea. So it's not like a normal city where you can just starve it out and wait for the defenders to surrender. Correct?
Yes, it's a very difficult place to take if you can't lock it off from the sea, and that is a big reason why the French have such trouble taking it. Really.
But it goes on for, gosh, I think a couple of years.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculously long siege, and it ties down a lot of men.
So how did Graham come up with a plan to raise this siege?
Well, as Graham was, his role there was to assist in the defense of the city, and he knew, or at least he felt that if that basically the defense needed to be more active, and so he was advising that if the opportunity presented itself, that a large force should be shipped out of Cadiz around the French flank to attack their rear, essentially. And they had to wait for a little while for the right opportunity to do this, but it did eventually occur. And in that time, you also have an interesting thing arise, but is the relationship between Graham and Wellington, and the fact that nobody's quite sure whether Graham is supposed to be subordinate to Wellington or doing his own thing.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting aspect as well. But we have this battle of Barbarossa, which kind of surprises Marshal Victor. Now, Marshal Victor is not the most brilliant general, but he's not a fool either. But it seems like he's somewhat surprised, and Graham inflicts 3,000 casualties on him. Can you kind of tell us what happened there and why this was an important victory for the British?
Yes, absolutely. The Battle of Barbarossa is a fascinating battle. It's weirdly cinematic in its retelling as well. It's done when Soult pulls his army further to the north of Seville, which sort of leaves Victor a little bit vulnerable to an attack from the garrison. You get a controversy because Graham is not actually in command of the strike force. It's about 11,000 men, composed of 7,000 Spaniards and 4,000 Anglo-Portuguese. Now, Graham is commander of the British and the Portuguese, but Graham is trying to work for the greater good here, and so he puts himself under the command, under the orders of General Pena.
Right.
And the Spanish advance guard successfully achieves the surprise on the French flank guards. They take a strategic position. Graham is given order. Graham at this point occupies the ridge or some position near it, but is then ordered to come down and secure the Spanish flank and rear, as presumably they're going to move on to attack the French. However, as Graham is pulling his men down to occupy this new position as per his orders from General Pena, he gets information that Victor has rushed to formations. I forget whether they're divisions or brigades. I think they're brigades, to basically take the high ground. And Graham, again with his eye for ground, realizes that if the French get hold of that position, they will have cut their line, they cut their supply line to Tarifa, which is where they had landed, I believe, and would basically have trapped them between Cadiz and the French. It would be a disaster. So Graham, not being a scientific soldier, is exactly the sort of guy you need right there at this moment.
Right. It sounds like a fluid situation. Like it's not a set piece battle.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's changing almost every second.
And timing is so crucial here. If Graham has hesitated for maybe even as much as half an hour, what happens next could not have happened, because Victor's men are rushing up to the high ground and coming basically down on Graham's flank. So what he does is he basically gets the entire boat. He has 2 brigades, I believe, and he turns them both around as they stand, basically. He gets them to turn back around towards the ridge and rush back up to the top.
Right.
This is not at all usual. This is not no parade ground niceties here. He basically just gets them to run back the way they came. And they just get into position as the French are also getting on top of the ridge, and Graham is here able to rely on the strange toughness of the British infantry to now sort of push this gamble into a success. The British artillery form a concentrated battery in the center. The 2 brigades hit the French at an optimum moment where they're unable to quite get their equilibrium, and it's a dramatic and completely surprising victory for the British. The French are thrown into disorder, and bear in mind that Graham's force, which is engaged, is about only 4,000 men strong, and Victor has thrown about 8,000 men at him.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Spanish, and I like to defend the Spanish. Generally speaking, I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt, but General La Peña does not help Graham at all.
Yeah, I've heard he kind of stands pat and doesn't do anything.
Yeah, but because he's technically the commander-in-chief, he claims the victory in the battle when he reports it to Madrid.
Yeah, it's a weird outcome because it doesn't raise the siege, but it infuriates Napoleon. It causes Marshal Victor to have somewhat of a setback, but it's a victory. I think maybe it's more of a moral victory because it shows that the British can go toe-to-toe with the French in this Grande Armée.
Oh yeah, it's another one of those curious battles which really kind of lends you to believe that the British infantry do kind of deserve that sort of invincible reputation that they have.
Yeah.
Because if you throw them at stuff, they tend to do a lot of damage even if they lose. And this is what Graham was able to count on in this battle, was the stolidity of the British infantry. He notably also, one of the regiments takes an eagle, the first eagle taken in battle.
That's right.
And it's not a good day for Victor, but because the Spanish don't pursue, Victor is able to sort of get clear. And so the Allies have nothing else to do but go back into Cadiz, really.
Right. Yeah, there's a great quote. I think it's Wellington who says, when I make a mistake, my troops usually get me out of it. When Marshal Soult's troops when Marshal Soult makes a mistake, his troops do not get him out of it. So I think like you were saying, the British infantry, they can kind of repair the mistakes of some of their commanders sometimes.
Yeah, it's like what Soult said about Beresford at Albuera. They were completely lost, but did not know it and would not run.
Right, yeah. But yeah, getting back to our story, in 1812, and again, I'll let you be the judge on this. I read that Graham is basically second in command now to Wellington and assists him in the successful siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. Now, we were talking earlier that we weren't sure if Wellington and Graham were working together well, but are they kind of getting along at this point?
Yes, they are. There was a little bit of tension after the Battle of Talavera in 1809 when Graham criticized the awarding of Wellington's title of the Earl of Wellington. But certainly by the time of Barrosa and by the time of 1812, they were getting along quite well. And Wellington was seeing a man that could be trusted to act independently a reliable man, and a man, most importantly, of good judgment. Now, not to stress a stereotype, which I myself am not convinced of, Graham also fulfills the classic sort of requirements for Wellington's trust, i.e., a man of talent and position.
Mm-hmm.
He's of the right class, sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Now, I don't lend too much store to that exactly. You know, the whole Wellington is a snob thing. I think that's
Right.
too much of a modern appreciation of what we're dealing with here.
Right.
But Graham is certainly a very well connected, a very well educated. He's of the right family. He is an instinctively good soldier, and Wellington appreciates this.
Yeah.
So the other thing is, as you were saying, you're completely right. In 1812, the government basically writes to Wellington saying that Graham is the second in command.
Mm-hmm.
If anything happens to you, give command to Graham.
Mm-hmm.
So don't let anybody tell you that Wellington didn't believe in seconds in command. He had one. It was Sir Thomas Graham.
Yeah.
And actually, this is proven by the fact that when Graham, spoiler alert, gets ill and has to go home, Wellington says, I don't want another second in command. That's what he meant by that. He said, basically, I just want Graham.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, Graham is 20 years older than Wellington. So he's maybe like the wise old sage of the general officers here.
Yeah, and by complete accident as well, because his like amount of service is, he's not seen as much action as Wellington. He's not seen as much action as most men.
Right.
But he is in this position, and despite people being a little uppity about the fact that he is there, this sort of amateur, he does good work. So it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah. Well, let's briefly cover off on the battle at Vittoria in 1813. He assists Wellington, and this is basically the decisive battle, or should I say basically the final battle within Spain for the Peninsula War. Can you tell us a bit what happens there? I know King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan kind of turn at bay to fight the British, but it doesn't go very well.
No, it doesn't go very well at all. There was some hope for the French in 1812 when they retook Madrid, and after the siege of Burgos, when Wellington retreated very famously back to the Portuguese border.
Mm-hmm.
But Wellington now had the measure of practically everybody in Spain, and he planned through all the winter this masterful, sweeping operation that would completely outfox the French. And a big part of this was Graham's division, which was operating on the flank of the French.
Mm-hmm.
Graham's task was to march through basically mountains and valleys, shielded at all times from the French view,
mm-hmm.
and to constantly outflank whatever position they tried to take to stop Wellington coming at them from the front. And he did this perfectly.
And I think that was probably difficult for Wellington as somewhat of a micromanager to kind of have this one guy be an independent command off on his own.
Absolutely, and it shows how much he trusted and respected Graham and Graham's judgment, because there were only two men in the army that he gave this leeway to, and that one was Hill and one was Graham.
Right.
And the both of them play a very central role in this much wider operation, where he's forced, because of the distances involved and the numbers involved, there's almost 100,000 men involved in the entire operation,
mm-hmm.
to get this done. And it shows what Wellington can really do if he's given the resources to do it. It gives you a snapshot of what he might have been able to do in a bigger theater, and that was take back everything that had been lost in 1812 up to the line of the Ebro River, without fighting a battle. He outmaneuvered the French. He levered them from every position back to Vittoria,
right?
And that's where Jourdan and Joseph tried to fight. But now Wellington is just completely the reverse of the stereotype of the defensive general. He now has them where he wants them. He constructs a multi-pronged attack to envelop them, and he pushes them back through several positions until the very last one, right in front of the city of Vittoria, where Graham's division gets across the river and is threatening to cut them off and completely surround them, and that's when the French army breaks and flees for its life.
Right. Yeah, it's just an interesting battle, and it would have been a greater victory, but as we all know the story, some of the British infantry stopped to loot the wagons that had King Joseph's spoils of war. They stopped to pick up all the gold that was on the ground, and I can't blame them, I guess.
Oh no! This is a very tempting target for any army, and I mean, it sent Wellington into utter, apoplexy. But
Yeah,
it was difficult to get a pursuit going when all the roads were jammed with French baggage that was full of treasure.
yeah. Well, and coming full circle now in our story, Napoleon abdicates in April of 1814, but there's one more battle that occurs after he abdicates in Toulouse, which is, where we had all of Graham's drama with his wife in this long epic. I mean, isn't that incredible that it kind of ended there?
It is actually, and I only just actually made that connection when you said it there, strangely enough, as well. Yeah. That is very poetic. I wonder what he thought of that.
It must have been gratifying and depressing at the same time.
I guess it must have been because, that battle is a bruising one, and it's not Wellington's finest hour. Soult puts up a very creditable defense, and basically elects to leave the field at the end of the day because he figures he's done enough damage.
Yeah, it's just kind of a poetic ending there. But this isn't the end of our friend Thomas Graham. What does he do in his later years after the age of Napoleon?
Well, I mean, the Age of Napoleon, he's still a little active in it, to be honest. Prior to the Battle of Toulouse, we should point out, just because the people who are listening to this are the people who pay attention to these sorts of things.
Sure.
He was in command of the siege of San Sebastian.
Yep.
Before that,
a brutal one.
Yep. A very brutal one, and this is where you kind of see Graham's weaknesses as a commander and also his advanced age. Some people are thinking he's starting to get a little old for this sort of thing. He doesn't handle it particularly brilliantly, but he does perform well in the open war campaigns. And then you get him being sent with a force to the Low Countries to support the Prussians.
Yeah, and he has a setback there. Yeah,
he does. It's in a life full of weirdness. The attack on Bergen op Zoom is insanity as well.
In fairness to Graham, though, Wellington wasn't the most adept at sieges either.
No, Wellington. I have thoughts about this, and if you want to do a whole thing about Wellington sieges, then we can. But Wellington had very specific criteria when he was doing his sieges, and they weren't calculated to make him look terribly good. He wasn't very experienced in formal siege warfare. They all had to be done very quickly. Graham's attack on Bergen op Zoom was something that nobody understood. Wellington said he didn't know how Graham got in, and then having got in, didn't understand how he could have been thrown out.
Right.
And that is essentially the summary of it. He got in when he shouldn't have been able to.
Right.
And then everything went tremendously and embarrassingly wrong.
Yeah.
Which wasn't necessarily his fault. It was just a series of events that he lost control of. And after that, he does retire.
Okay.
He doesn't see service in 1815.
He's not at Waterloo. Yeah.
No. Wellington probably would have liked him to be in Belgium in 1815, but he was tired. He was having troubles with his sight. His health was failing again. And This is where he gets his title. This is where he gets Lord Lynedoch when he returns in 1814. And he devotes himself again to country pursuits and land management. So you might say he has actually vanquished the demons that he sought to vanquish. He's at peace now, you might say. He never remarries, of course, but he gets more involved in politics. He founds the United Services Club in 1817. He travels through Europe. He goes and meets old comrades and walks old battlefields.
Right.
Apparently, he was even offered the command of the armies of the Queen of Portugal in the 1820s when he was 86.
Yeah, he had a very hard life, and I think this is interesting to me. It just shows, again, the word perseverance to me. He passes in London at the old age of 95 in 1843.
Yep. This is why this episode is so long. Because he lives so long.
Yeah, I mean, talk about packing your life full of adventure. I mean, good adventures in Historyland. There you go.
Exactly. This is a classic one.
What do you think his legacy is, though?
I think that Sir Thomas Graham, as he became, lived two lives. He got to live two lives, you might say. In many ways, the shot that wounded him at Toulon was a sort of a rebirth, I think. And his great mission in life thereafter seemed to be to either rejoin Mary in death or to distract himself by active service so much that he made himself so useful as to forget what happened.
Right.
As I said, he never remarried, and so he had no children. So his legacy is very much his efforts to sort of improve land management in Perthshire and his officers' club and his renown as the victor of Barossa. And fittingly, actually, I think his legacy is also the portraits he commissioned of Mary. So that's, I think, his legacy today. It's not as grand, say, as even Hill's, and certainly not as Wellington's, but it stands as a very unique military and sort of civilian life, a very 18th century life in a way.
I think you hit the nail on the head, though. He lived two lives, and I think what I take away from it, at the age of 43, he started his career in the military, and what that means to me is it's never too late to, seek a career that you want to do, or change your life. It's never too late to change your life. Is really what I get out of it.
It's never too late to make a difference if you can find the means to do so. And Graham is very much a strangely relatable figure to that, because you're presented with the genius of Napoleon or the genius of Wellington, the capability of the regular officers in the army who just always seem to know the right thing to do through training and professionalism. And here's Sir Thomas Graham, a patrician farmer from Perthshire, who said, I'm going to make a difference, and I'm going to get revenge on the people who made the passing of my wife such an extra trial to me.
But just what a life. And I really appreciate you kind of give us that insight and educating on his life. It was truly remarkable. So thank you for that.
No, it's my pleasure. Graham is legitimately one of my favorite characters of the period. Probably he could be my favorite British general that isn't Wellington, to be honest.
No, it's quite a life. One more call out for your YouTube page. It's Adventures in Historyland, and if you want to check out Josh on Twitter, it's
at Land of History, but because of the similarity in the sound, some people call me Lando.
Got it. Well, I appreciate all of this. It was a great episode, and thank you for your time.
No, thank you very much.